Hyperborea, Lemuria, Agartha, Atlantis. These civilizations, like others, were believed to be mythical, mere creations, but what if they're more than that? What if Atlantis really existed? And why did Plato feel so called to document it towards the end of his life? In this video, I'll be answering all those questions and more. I will be covering the writings from historians, philosophers, geologists throughout history who believed that Atlantis was real. I'll be then discussing potential locations for Atlantis, where it may have existed, and what might have happened to it. And finally, I'll be sharing my personal thoughts on what I think about Atlantis, the history of it, the mythology of it, and not only why I think it's so fascinating, but why I think it might be important for us. So let's dive in. The origins of Atlantis come from Plato around 360 BC, when he writes in his Timaeus and Critias of the information that was passed down to him from his ancestor Solon, who visited Egypt around 590 to 600 BC. Solon said to have spoken to Egyptian priests in Sais, who condemned him and his fellow Greeks for not keeping extensive historical records and therefore not knowing about their Atlantean forefathers, whereas the Egyptians had known about Atlantis for millennia because of their strict record keeping. Plato describes Atlantis as a vast and powerful empire located just beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, or what used to be known as the Pillars of Hercules. So it's vaguely somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. But you have to remember, the Pillars of Hercules back in the day were like the edge of the world to the ancient Greeks and people living in the Mediterranean. They didn't know that there was anything beyond the Atlantic, except for Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis was an island landmass that had concentric rings of land and water, with a grand central temple to Poseidon in the middle of it, because Poseidon was believed to be the progenitor of the Atlantean race. Basically, Poseidon slept with a mortal woman and bred this civilization of demigods that lived on Atlantis. Plato describes the descendants of Atlantis being demigods blessed with physical and intellectual gifts. According to other authors, Atlanteans were said to be tall, with fair skin, light eyes, and geometric patterns on their skin. Sounds a lot like tattoos, and it sounds a lot like Vikings, which is important to remember. We'll be coming around to that later. According to Plato's account, Atlantis fell due to hubris. Over time, the Atlanteans became corrupt, abandoning their virtues for greed and conquest. The gods, angered by their arrogance, punished them. As Plato writes, in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. While skeptics argue that Plato's account is merely an allegory, some historians, philosophers, and geologists believe that it is true. They believe that Plato wrote about them to not only warn against hubris, but to document an important piece of history that Plato felt was at risk of being lost. First, let's talk about the philosophical tradition of Atlantis. Some modern philosophers not only lend credibility to the existence of Atlantis, but actually the existence of the Atlantean race or the Atlantean peoples that descended from the lost Atlantis. Helena Blavatsky was a 19th century mystic that argued that Atlantis was real and described it as the origin of several human races. She writes, "The Atlanteans were the fourth root race, and their decline marked a spiritual regression of humanity. Their remnants, scattered across the earth, seeded the wisdom traditions of ancient Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica." Jose Vasconcelos is also a proponent of this theory. He writes in his book La Raza Cósmica that the Atlanteans were one of humanity's original lineages, along with the European or white race, the black or African race, the Asian race, and the indigenous race. He believed that the Atlanteans were the fifth race. Vasconcelos believed that the Atlanteans had been absorbed by the other four races and no longer existed independently. He believed that each race had unique gifts and skills, and that the blending of all five races would ultimately lead to the ultimate human race, the cosmic race as he calls it. But the blending of Atlantean blood was the thing that would allow them to actually transcend humanity. Philosopher Rudolf Steiner, like Plato, also believed that the Atlanteans were a race of people who were technologically and spiritually advanced, but ultimately fell due to the misuse of their technologies and advancements. Steiner argued that the Atlantean survivors spread their knowledge elsewhere and influenced ancient cultures around the world. And now let's move on to the historians. Diodorus Siculus was a Greek philosopher from the 1st century BC who mentioned a people called the Atlanteans. Diodorus described the Atlanteans as being a strong breed of people, living near the Canary Islands and having descended from Poseidon himself. 19th century historian Ignatius Donnelly writes in his Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, that Atlantis is rooted in historical truth. Donnelly linked Atlantis to the ancient flood myths, the account of the biblical Noah's Ark and the Hindu tale of Manu, and many other cultures throughout history have had this flood myth. And Donnelly believes that this flood was what ultimately destroyed Atlantis. He suggested that Atlantis was the mother progenitor of all other ancient cultures and nations within the world. And as we will discuss later, he was one of the first proponents of the mid-Atlantic continent theory for Atlantis. Historian Charles Hapgood was best known for his controversial theory of Earth crust displacement, which he connected to the potential existence and disappearance of Atlantis. He's not a philosopher or a geologist in the traditional sense, and he's considered a pseudo-scientific historian, as anyone who discusses Atlantis would be. But his work was actually highly regarded amongst other scientists. His theory of Earth crust displacement was actually supported by Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to his book, Earth's Shifting Crust, even though Einstein did make sure to distance himself from his other, more esoteric ideas. But he essentially argued that through shifts in the Earth's crust, this causes geological changes and cataclysmic conditions that can completely wipe out entire land masses, and is most likely the reason for the disappearance of many ancient civilizations. Hapgood firmly believed that Atlantis was an ancient civilization that flourished before 10,000 BC. He theorized that the sudden crustal displacement submerged Atlantis underwater in one catastrophic event, which aligns with Plato's description of Atlantis disappearing in a single day and night. However, in his later works, Hapgood also added that it's also possible that it existed in Antarctica. He claimed through his Earth crust displacement theory that Antarctica had once been a temperate location where civilization could have thrived, and because of the shifting crust, it moved Antarctica into its current position at the South Pole, burying any evidence of civilization under layers of ice. He cited the Piri Reis map of the 16th century. It's a medieval map that appears to depict parts of Antarctica without ice. He claims that this is evidence that there were previous civilizations on Antarctica and people may have visited it and seen it without ice. Finally, we have Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce was not a historian, he was not a philosopher, and he was not a geologist. He was a psychic, a clairvoyant, a mystic. He was also known as the Sleeping Prophet, and he provided detailed descriptions of Atlantis during his trance states. He also claimed that Atlantis was a highly advanced civilization that fell due to their misuse of their technology. Cayce believed that its survivors migrated into other parts of the world like Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and spread their knowledge to those cultures as well. He ultimately believed that Atlantis existed somewhere in the Caribbean, perhaps near the Bermuda Triangle, and he predicted that the first archaeological pieces of Atlantis would be discovered in the 20th century. And wouldn't you know it, 15 years later, archaeologists discovered off the coast of the Bahamas what is known as the Bimini Road. We will get more into Bimini Road in a second, but think about how cool that is. He writes, "The records of Atlantis will be found, and with them the forgotten wisdom of humanity's golden age." Now, we haven't found any hidden wisdom of humanity's golden age, but we did find a road, stone wall structure. So maybe that's a start. Okay, so potential locations. Where was Atlantis? Over the years, people have proposed numerous locations, and each of them have their own sort of compelling evidence. Obviously, number one, and my favorite explanation, is generally the Atlantic Ocean. Plato explicitly placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, so it's gotta be somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean past the Strait of Gibraltar. Ignatius Donnelly argued that Atlantis was a mid-Atlantic continent that basically spanned from the Americas all the way to Europe, down to north of Africa. He points to the Portuguese islands of Azores off the coast of Europe as being the last remnants of the island of Atlantis. Just to flex really quick, I did take a DNA test, and it turns out that I'm 25% Portuguese, and it is most likely from the region of Azores, which would essentially mean that I am 25% or 1/4 Atlantean. Yeah, so anyways, Donnelly and many others theorized that Atlantis was destroyed during the Younger Dryas period. This was a period 10,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age that caused massive volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and ultimately quickly rising sea levels. But this idea that Atlantis was an entire continent that spanned the Atlantic makes for really interesting connections with other cultures and civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been living on the Americas for 20,000 years now. So if Atlantis did exist, it is entirely possible that the Atlanteans could have communicated with people in the Americas, in Europe, and in Africa. What piques my imagination in this case is the Mesoamerican myths of Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is the Aztec and also, I believe, Mayan feathered serpent god who is depicted as being a fair-skinned, light-haired, bearded man who arrived after a great flood bearing knowledge of astronomy and agriculture. It's a white man who came on a boat and taught them astronomy and farming. And some argue that these are merely European travelers that reached Mesoamerica, but this myth dates back to the 1st century BC, which is over 1,000 years before the first European travelers would ever make it to the Americas, and 1,500 years roughly before they would ever make it into Central and South America. This means that the Mayans and the Aztecs had interacted with whites or Europeans, or maybe Atlanteans, before the 1st century BC. What's interesting about this is that cultural anthropology shows us that people typically like to depict gods or God as looking like them. But in the case of the Mesoamericans, who compared to the Europeans are a bit shorter, have darker hair, darker skin, and typically don't grow much facial hair, for some reason depicted a god that looked absolutely nothing like them. But not only nothing like them, but looked like other people, who they by this point had supposedly never met before. Atlantean refugees are also thought to have brought their wisdom to Egypt and North Africa. It's thought that they brought advanced architectural techniques to the Nile Valley, which is why we have the pyramids, similar to the ones in early Mesoamerica. And this is not to suggest that the Atlanteans necessarily were the ones who taught them how to build pyramids. Maybe they learned it from the Mesoamericans that they met and then they brought it over to Egypt, or maybe vice versa, who knows? All we know is there's some interesting connection and interaction going on. The next theory is that Atlantis resided somewhere in the Mediterranean. Some believe that Atlantis could be linked to the Minoan civilization that used to live on Crete. They were destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, which is modern Santorini, around 1600 BC. The disaster aligns with Plato's description of what happened to Atlantis. They were destroyed, wiped out in a single day and night, and volcanic eruptions and massive tidal waves. The whole hubris thing makes sense too, because the Minoans were a seafaring people and they traveled around the Mediterranean and attacked neighboring nations. But this Bronze Age time period is incredibly recent and it doesn't line up at all with Plato's account of when Atlantis existed and when it was destroyed. It's like 8,000, 9,000 years off. The location is also way off. Up next, we have the Caribbean. The Caribbean is in the Atlantic, and we also have like the Bermuda Triangle where a bunch of other weird stuff happens. So I think it's perfectly plausible that something like Atlantis with advanced technology could have disappeared near the Bermuda Triangle and could be causing all of the weird disappearances and disruptions that occur in that area today. I mentioned Edgar Cayce earlier, and I talked about how he predicted that Atlantis would be found in the 20th century, and that's exactly what happened, because in the 1960s, archaeologists found Bimini Road located off the coast of the Bahamas. It's an underwater structure, and it looks just like a stone road with stone walls going up it. It's all perfectly cut rectangles, and it's laid out. It's like you look at it and you know it's not natural. It's man-made for sure. The reason that researchers are interested in it being possibly linked to Atlantis or an ancient civilization from the pre-Younger Dryas period is because the depth at which it sits on the sea floor is exactly the level that the sea level would have been at 10,000 years ago. So the time at which the road would have been above water correlates with Plato's timeline. And although it is a great distance away from the Pillars of Hercules, it's still technically beyond the Pillars of Hercules. So Plato and the Egyptians wouldn't necessarily be wrong in their placement of it either. And lastly, a notable theory, but I don't think that it holds any good credibility, is the idea that it existed on Antarctica. The Piri Reis map shows that some people may have discovered Antarctica before it was this barren wasteland covered in ice, and that an ancient civilization may have once flourished there. But I don't really know. It seems too far away from the Atlantic, and also if I had to take a guess, I'd guess that Antarctica was covered in ice before 10,000 years ago. Now, I'm more focused on the written history of Atlantis, but there are new archaeological excavations of underwater structures being discovered all the time. There's these crazy sunken islands off of the Canary Islands that could potentially be linked to Atlantis, as Diodorus Siculus was talking about. We also have this entire chain of islands along the Atlantic Ridge that looks something like a mountain range, which could have been associated with a natural landmass on the island of Atlantis before it sank. Doggerland is also another submerged landmass in the North Sea that once connected Britain to Europe. This isn't linked to Atlantis at all, but it absolutely shows that advanced coastal civilizations were completely drowned and submerged underwater due to cataclysmic events and rising sea levels. So, what do I think? Well, for one, I believe that all myths contain kernels of truth, and some myths contain more truth than others. Atlantis is one of those myths that I believe can very well be true, especially in regards to the fact that we know we have lost advanced civilizations that are now being discovered as having truly existed. And for some reason, we were taught to just dismiss them as myth. For centuries, we were taught to believe that the Greco-Trojan Wars were completely myth, and that the ancient city of Troy never existed either. And then Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century goes and discovers ancient Troy. We now know it's a real place, so now all they have to do is try and discount the fact that the Trojan Wars never existed. Good luck with that. I don't believe that either. Trojan War was absolutely real. Göbekli Tepe is also a prime example of an advanced ancient civilization that existed more than 10,000 years ago, which shows that humans were much more capable of achieving advanced civilizations than we had ever thought previously. Göbekli Tepe and the ancient city of Troy, in my opinion, show me that Atlantis could very well be real too. While I don't personally believe that Atlantis was inhabited by a superhuman species of demigods that harnessed the power of crystals or something like that, I think it is very possible that an ancient society existed somewhere out in the Atlantic, and I think that they very well could have interacted with peoples in the Americas and in Europe and in Africa. And I think it's also possible that they're simply hiding it from us. We clearly have evidence that cultures all around the world may have interacted with each other at one point due to land bridges that existed. And then once the sea level started to rise and the land bridges disappeared, we became separated. I think Atlantis may have very well been one of these land bridges, this landmass that connected continents before the sea levels rose. I think cataclysmic events absolutely could have wiped out Atlantis. I think there's crazier stories out there. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The channel is brand new. I hope that I didn't pigeonhole myself by making a video on Atlantis. Please give me a like and share the video with someone that you think might enjoy it. Subscribe if you're interested in seeing more philosophical and historical content like this. I'm gonna have more content coming out about actual philosophy, I promise. This was just a fun video that I decided to make to sort of show where my interests lie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.